In the summer of 2001, three 7-year-old girls, triplets, vanished without a trace during a church picnic in a quiet Pennsylvania town. No witnesses, no footprints, no signs of struggle. Just silence. The entire town froze in disbelief. Search teams scoured the woods. Helicopters hovered above. Flyers flooded every mailbox. But nothing surfaced. Days turned into weeks, and the search turned into mourning their mother, Rebecca Whitmore. Refused to give up, haunted by memories, clinging to hope, and tormented by the question, where did they go? 17 years later, a young woman walked into a police station in Ohio. She had no ID, no history, but she claimed to be one of the missing triplets. And when her DNA confirmed to the world held its breath, what she revealed next shocked everyone, because the truth of what really happened that day was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. It was June 24th. 2001, a warm Sunday afternoon, in the peaceful town of Brookville, Pennsylvania. Families gathered behind St. Mary's Church for the annual summer picnic. Children ran barefoot to the grass. Tables overflowed with food, and laughter echoed under the open sky. For the Whitmore family, it was meant to be a day of joy, faith, and togetherness. Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore had brought their three daughters, triplets Emma, Lily, and Grace, each 7 years old, and nearly inseparable since birth, with matching sundresses and bright ribbons in their hair. The girls spent the afternoon playing near the tree inn, just behind the church, chasing butterflies and giggling with their classmates. It was a scene that looked like something out of a postcard, until it wasn't. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Rebecca turned to check on her daughters, only to find an empty clearing where they'd been moments before. She called their names at first casually. Then, with rising panic, Daniel ran toward the trees, thinking maybe they wandered further than they were supposed to. But within minutes, other parents began to notice the urgency in Rebecca's voice. The girls were nowhere in sight. At 3:35 p.m., 911 was called. Within an hour, Brookville police arrived on scene. By sunset, the area had become a full-scale search site. Volunteers lined up in rows, sweeping to the nearby woods. Dogs were brought in. Officers questioned every adult and child present. A helicopter hovered above, scanning the landscape with thermal imaging. But despite their efforts, there were no clues, no broken branches, no discarded belongings, no footprints leading away. It was as if the triplets had simply vanished into thin air. The media caught on quickly. By that evening, local news channels were broadcasting urgent bulletins. Three sisters missing from church picnic. Photos of the girls smiling, holding hands in front of their school, flashed across every screen. Rebecca stood in front of cameras, her voice trembling as she pleaded for their return. Days passed, and weeks. Hundreds of flyers were posted throughout the county. Police set up hotlines, followed every tip, investigated every sighting. But nothing led to the girls. There were no ransom calls, no suspicious vehicles caught on traffic cameras, no witnesses who remembered seeing the triplets leave the picnic area. The church parking lot had been full, but no one had noticed anything unusual. By July, the tone of the investigation had shifted. The Whiters were no longer the sympathetic, grieving parents. Rumors began circulating. People whisper about Daniel's cold demeanor, about a recent argument overheard between him and a neighbor. Some even suggested that the family knew more than they were saying, but police found no evidence of wrongdoing and no suspects. The FBI eventually stepped in, classifying the case as an abduction with unknown motives, but with no leads and no physical evidence. The investigation slowed. Eventually, it was moved into cold case status. The Whitmore family was left with silent suspicion and a house full of empty bedrooms. Rebecca refused to move on. Every year on June 24th, she hosted a candlelight vigil outside the church. She kept the girls' room exactly the way it was. Their beds, made their books still on the shelves. The stuffed rabbit Emma had carried that day still sitting on the windowsill. She believed somehow that they were alive. They didn't disappear. She told a local reporter in 2007 someone took them, and someone knows what happened. Meanwhile, the rest of Brookville tried to forget the story, faded from the news cycle. The church picnic continued. In later years, though fewer people came, parents held their children tighter. Trust wore thin. For 17 years, the town lived with a wound that never closed. And then in March of 2018, something happened. A young woman, roughly 24 years old, walked into a police station in Cleveland, Ohio. She had no identification, no known relatives, and no memory of her early childhood. She only knew she had been raised by an older woman, who died a year before the woman had told her before, passing that she was not her biological mother and that there were things about her, past that had been better left unsaid, but the girl had questions, and when her DNA was tested as part of a routine missing persons check, everything changed. The results came back with a match not partial, not close, exact as woman. Was Emma Whitmore one of the three triplets who vanished 17 years earlier the revelation hit, like a lightning strike 17 years after the church picnic that shattered the lives of the Whitmore family? Emma was alive, but the joy of discovery was quickly overtaken by confusion. A young woman sitting across from the detective in Cleveland, Ohio, didn't remember being Emma. She didn't remember her sisters. She didn't even remember Brookville. Her voice was calm, steady, but hollow. It was a voice of someone who had lived in the shadow of a lie her entire life. The police immediately contacted the authorities in Pennsylvania. When the call came and Rebecca Whitmore was watering her garden, a quiet task she had taken up to distract herself from the ache that never left, she dropped the hose as soon as she heard the officer's words. Emma found alive, her knees buckled, tears filled her eyes. She didn't ask if it was a mistake. She simply whispered, "I knew it. I knew she was out there." Rebecca was flown to Cleveland under police escort. When she entered the room at the police station, she saw a young woman with her daughter's eyes. Emma stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Rebecca reached out, her hands trembling. She didn't demand recognition. She simply said, "You're home." Emma didn't cry, she didn't speak, but she took Rebecca's hand and held it like something fragile. An unfamiliar silence passed between them that said more than words ever could. A reunion was careful, tender, and filled with uncertainty. Over the next several days, Emma was brought back to Pennsylvania and placed under careful psychological observation. Doctors hoped that the familiar environment might trigger lost memories, but Emma's mind was a locked door, and no one knew where the key was. What she did remember was fragmented and strange. She had grown up in a remote farmhouse in rural Ohio, raised by a woman she knew only as Miss Connie. The woman was strict, but not cruel, distant, but never violent. Emma had been homeschooled, rarely allowed outside, and never permitted to ask questions about her past. She had no birth certificate, no photos of her childhood, no friends. Connie had told her from a young age that her mother had died of a heart attack, and that she had no siblings. Whenever Emma asked more, Connie would grow quiet and say, "Some things are better left alone." Emma never pressed. She accepted the story because it was the only one she had. But after Connie passed away the year before, something shifted. While going through old boxes in the attic, Emma found a faded photograph tucked inside a book. It showed three identical little girls standing in a line wearing matching sundresses. In the corner, in smeared ink, was a name Whitmore. Her name. Emma couldn't explain why, but the moment she saw that photo, her chest tightened. It felt like looking into a memory she didn't know she had. That's when she began to question everything. She started searching online, trying to find the name Whitmore, and eventually stumbled upon a cold case website that featured her own missing photo. That's when she knew the news broke. Quickly, missing triplet found alive after 17 years flashed across national news stations. Journalists camped outside the Whitmore home. The town of Brookville, once numb to the pain, erupted in stunned disbelief. People whispered in grocery stores, speculated in church pews, and posted on Facebook. But beneath the shock was a deeper question. Where were Lily and Grace? And why had Emma been spared? Emma remained quiet for several weeks. After returning, she spent most of her time alone, watching the wind blow through the trees behind her childhood home. She didn't remember the picnic. She didn't remember her sisters. But sometimes in her dreams, she saw flashes, bare feet on wet grass, the sound of laughter, the feeling of being pulled by the hand. One night, as a storm raged outside, Emma finally spoke. She told her mother about a dark room with no windows, a place she had lived in for a time before being moved to the farmhouse. She remembered her sisters crying in the same room. She remembered them being taken away one at a time, and she remembered Connie telling her that she was a quiet one, and that quiet girls got to stay. Rebecca listened, her heart in pieces. of horror wasn't just that Emma had been stolen. It was that someone had chosen which child to keep and discarded the others. The days following Emma's memory breakthrough were tense and quiet. Rebecca stayed close by, afraid to push her daughter too hard, but terrified to lose what little fragment of the truth She was finally beginning to recover. Local investigators reopened the case with renewed urgency now. They had a living witness, someone who had survived, but Emma's memories were scattered like pieces of a puzzle that had been burned and buried for nearly 2 decades. She remembered being led away from the picnic, though she couldn't recall by whom. She remembered the feeling of her hand in an adult's grip, firm and fast. She recalled the scent of something sweet and rotting, and the sound of van doors slamming shut. Then darkness. The clearest image that emerged was a room Emma described: a cold, windowless space with peeling wallpaper and a single bare bulb that flickered overhead. She and her sisters were kept together in that room at first. They slept on thin mattresses, ate bland food from paper plates, and were told not to cry. A voice, Connie's, would speak through the door: "Good girls, don't make noise. Good girls get to go home someday." But they never did. One day Lily was taken out. Emma remembered her sister's small hand slipping away. She never saw her again. A week later, Grace was gone. To Emma was left alone. She cried and screamed for days. Connie didn't return for a long time, and when she did, she brought Emma upstairs and told her, "You're the quiet one, the good one, the only one who didn't fight." That was the day the story changed. Emma was no longer missing. She was someone else entirely. Connie renamed her Anna. She burned the girls' clothing and threw away everything from the basement. From then on, Emma lived in isolation, homeschool fed stories, and shaped into a different person. Her memories, suppressed by fear and manipulation, became foggy fragments buried deep in her mind. Now, 17 years later, the police had a thread to follow. But it wasn't easy. Connie had died the year before from lung cancer. Her farmhouse was abandoned and sold off at auction. By the time authorities arrived, it had been stripped of nearly everything. No records, no photos, no signs of the dark basement room. Emma had described only a remodeled guest room with fresh drywall and new floors. But the floor plan held a clue: the original blueprints of the house found in county records revealed that a small cellar space had existed directly beneath the room. Emma remembered it had been sealed up according to renovation documents. Sometime in 2007, police tore up the floorboards. What they found chilled them to the bone. The space was real. It matched Emma's memories: a narrow, claustrophobic chamber with crumbling concrete walls and rusted pipes overhead. In the corner lay a discarded child's sandal, faded pink, with a torn strap. Forensics later matched it to the shoes the triplets had been wearing the day they vanished. But that was all. No bones, no blood, no clear sign of Lily or Grace. Just enough to prove Emma had been telling the truth, and not enough to explain what happened to her sisters. Investigators began questioning Connie's old acquaintances. A former neighbor remembered hearing strange noises at night, but had dismissed them as animals. A retired mailman recalled never delivering mail directly. Connie always picked it up at the post office, saying she preferred privacy. A distant relative admitted that Connie had once worked as a church janitor, but was fired for inappropriate behavior around children. It was the first time anyone had connected her to Brookville. The theory slowly formed: Connie had either taken the girls herself or been paid to hide them. But who else had known? Why take 3 children only to keep one? As detectives traced Connie's financial history, they uncovered on outside. Emma finally spoke. She told her mother about a dark room with no windows, a place she had lived in for a time before being moved to the farmhouse. She remembered her sisters cry in the same room. She remembered them being taken away one at a time. And she remembered Connie telling her that she was a quiet one, and that quiet girl's got to stay. Rebecca listened, her heart in pieces of horror. It wasn't just that Emma had been stolen. It was that someone had chosen which child to keep and discarded the others. The days following Emma's memory breakthrough were tense and quiet. Rebecca stayed close by, afraid to push her daughter too hard, but terrified to lose what little fragments of the truth she was finally beginning to recover. Local investigators reopened the case with renewed urgency. Now they had a living witness, someone who had survived, but Emma's memories were scattered like pieces of a puzzle that had been burned and buried for nearly 2 decades. She remembered being led away from the picnic, though she couldn't recall by whom. She remembered the feeling of her hand in an adult's grip, firm and fast. She recalled the scent of something sweet and rotting, and the sound of van doors slamming shut. Then darkness. The clearest image that emerged was a room Emma described: a cold, windowless space with peeling wallpaper and a single bare bulb that flickered overhead she and her sisters were kept together in that room at. First, they slept on thin mattresses, ate bland food from paper plates, and were told not to cry. A voice Connie's would speak through the door. Good girls don't make noise, good girls could go home someday. But they never did. One day Lily was taken out. Emma remembered her sister's small hand slipping away. She never saw her again. A week later, Grace was gone too. Emma was left alone. She cried and screamed for days. Connie didn't return for a long time. And when she did, she brought Emma upstairs and told her, "You're the quiet one, the good one, the only one who didn't fight." That was the day the story changed. Emma was no longer missing. She was someone else entirely. Connie renamed her Anna. She burned the girls' clothing and threw away everything from the basement. From then on, Emma lived in isolation, homeschool-fed stories, and shaped into a different person. Her memories, suppressed by fear and manipulation, became foggy fragments buried deep in her mind. Now, 17 years later, the police had a thread to follow. But it wasn't easy. Connie had died the year before from lung cancer. Her farmhouse was abandoned and sold off at auction. By the time authorities arrived, it had been stripped of nearly everything. No records, no photos, no signs of the dark basement room. Emma had described only a remodeled guest room with fresh drywall and new floors. But the floor plan held a clue. The original blueprints of the house found in county records revealed that a small cellar space had existed directly beneath the room. Emma remembered it had been sealed up according to renovation documents. Sometime in 2007, police tore up the floorboards where they found children to the bone. The space was real. It matched Emma's memories, a narrow, claustrophobic chamber with crumbling concrete walls and rusted pipes. Overhead in the corner lay a discarded child's sandal-faded pink with a torn strap. Forensics later matched it to the shoes the triplets had been wearing the day they vanished. But that was all. No bones, no blood, no clear sign of Lily or Grace, just enough to prove Emma had been telling the truth and not enough to explain what happened to her sisters. Investigators began questioning Connie's old acquaintances. A former neighbor remembered hearing strange noises at night, but had dismissed them as animals. A retired mailman recalled never delivering mail directly. Connie always picked it up at the post office, saying she preferred privacy. A distant relative admitted that Connie had once worked as a church janitor, but was fired for inappropriate behavior around children. It was the first time anyone had connected her to Brookville. The theory slowly formed. Connie had either taken the girls herself or been paid to hide them. But who else had known? Why take 3 children only to keep one? As detectives traced Connie's financial history, they uncovered one final unexplained payment, $10,000 deposited into her account in July 2001, a month after the triplets vanished. The source, a now defunct LLC registered to a P.O. box in New Jersey. Whatever happened to Lily and Grace wasn't random. It was planned. Meanwhile, Emma struggled to cope. Every breakthrough brought new pain. She felt guilt for surviving, for being the one who got to stay. She didn't remember enough to save her sisters, but she couldn't forget the silence of that room, the absence, the choices won. Night she asked her mother, "Why me?" Rebecca didn't have an answer, but deep down she feared the truth, that someone had chosen her daughter and discarded the rest. And that person was still out there to discover. The sealed basement changed everything. It wasn't just about Emma anymore. It was about Lily and Grace, and who decided they didn't deserve to survive. Detectives began digging into Connie's life with new urgency. She had always been a recluse in the town of Willow Creek, Ohio. No friends, no social ties, no jobber. Neighbors knew little about her, except that she kept to herself and never liked visitors. But one thing stood out: she never seemed short on money, despite not working. Bank records confirmed a troubling pattern. Aside from the $10,000 deposit shortly after the triplets vanished, there were smaller payments, $3 to $5,000, made regularly for over a decade. They came from different accounts under different names, all traced back to shell corporations with no real business activity. Someone was paying Connie to keep Emma hidden. But why? The deeper the investigators looked, the more twisted the picture became. An anonymous tip led detectives to an old photograph taken in 2001, year before the abduction. It showed Connie standing at a church social event in Brookville. In the background, holding a clipboard, was a man named Richard Galloway, then a respected deacon. at St. Mary's Church. He had moved out of state in 2003 and vanished. From public life authorities, tracked him to a retirement community in Florida. When questioned, Richard denied knowing Connie personally, but phone records told another story. The two had exchanged dozens of calls between 2000 and 2002. Surveillance from an ATM captured him withdrawing large sums of cash days before the abduction. And then there was the most chilling discovery of all in a box of old church records. A staff roster from 2001 listed Connie Ellis as a temporary substitute for the church nursery the week before the picnic. She had been inside the building. She had known the layout. She had access to the children. Suddenly, the abduction didn't look like a random act of madness. It looked like a well-planned operation, one that involved more than one person and more than one motive. But what was the goal? Emma, with the help of therapists and memory specialists, began to recall more details. She remembered overhearing voices, Connie, and a man argue about too many mouths to feed, about one being enough, about getting rid of the problem. She remembered being told to forget her name, to forget she ever had sisters, and when she cried at night, Connie would sit beside her bed and whisper, "You're lucky you were chosen." The phrase echoed through Emma's mind like a curse of media once fascinated by the miraculous survival story, now circled with sharper teeth. They asked the hard questions. Was the church involved? Was there a child trafficking ring? Why hadn't anyone investigated Connie? Soon the police, under pressure, formed a special task force, but their hands were tied. Connie was dead. Richard Galloway, now frail and legally blind, couldn't be charged without hard evidence. The corporations that had funneled money had long since dissolved. Rebecca felt the walls closing, and every step forward brought more horror, but never the answer she truly wanted. Where were Lily and Grace? She visited Connie's grave one cloudy afternoon. Emma came too reluctant, but curious. There was no headstone, just a flat marker with a name and 2 dates. Rebecca stood over it in silence, then whispered, "Why them?" Emma knelt beside her. "I don't think she ever thought of us as people," she said, "just things to be given hidden or thrown away." Back at home, Emma started painting. It was something she had done in secret during her years in the farmhouse. Now she painted what she could remember: the dark room, the crooked stairs, her sisters' faces. With each brush stroke, her memory sharpened, and with each painting, Rebecca saw more of her daughter return. But healing didn't erase the injustice. The town of Brookville was shaken to its core. St. Mary's Church came under fire, with former members speaking out about other strange incidents over the years. Some claimed to have seen Connie on church grounds long after her dismissal. Others said Richard Galloway had too much control over staff, especially during children's events. The institution denied everything, and yet there was no denying what had happened to the Whitmore family. Emma had been taken hidden, and lied to her sisters had been erased, and the truth, no matter how close it came, still felt painfully out of reach. Hope can be the cruelest companion. With Emma safely home and disturbing truths coming to light, Rebecca Whitmore refused to accept that her other daughters were gone forever. She told herself if Emma was alive, if she had survived 17 years under a false identity, then Lily and Grace might still be somewhere waiting. She poured her energy into finding the old billboard that once displayed the triplets' faces. In 2001 was restored and reinstalled by the town's highway. This time only 2 faces remained under the word "still missing." Rebecca appeared on national television again, this time sitting beside her daughter Emma, holding her mother's hand, tightly shared what little she knew. She described the voices, the footsteps beyond the basement door, and the sound of crying that wasn't her own. "I think they were taken away from me one at a time," she said, her voice quiet. "And they never came back." The interview reignited national attention. Triplets were reopened. Calls flooded in, some from psychics, others from people claiming they had seen girls who resembled the missing children. One caller from West Virginia insisted she had once seen 2 young girls being led into a barn in 2003. Another woman in Michigan reported a memory of a gas station encounter with 2 frightened children who refused to speak. Investigators chased every lead. Nothing stuck. Meanwhile, a private search firm specializing in long-term child abduction was hired by the family, using funds raised through a public campaign, with access to facial recognition software, digital archives, and Missing persons databases, they scoured school yearbooks, social media, and online forums. They ran simulations of what Lily and Grace might look like at age 24, but no match was ever confirmed. A breakthrough seemed close when an anonymous letter arrived at the Brookville Police Department. It was handwritten in shaky script and postmarked from New Mexico. It read, "They weren't meant to be found, they were a message. The quiet one was a mistake. You should have stopped digging. The letter had no return address, no fingerprints, and no DNA traceable to any known profile. Forensic analysts deemed it authentic. And deeply troubling, FBI agents revisited Connie's farmhouse, but again found no trace of the other two girls. They reached out to regional law enforcement across 4 states, asking for help re-examining any unidentified remains of young girls from 2001 to 2005. Nothing fit. Rebecca began to feel the heavy toll of time. Her energy waned, media interest faded. Emma struggled too as her memories returned in fragments. So did the guilt. She often woke screaming in the middle of the night, calling out her sister's names. Therapy helped, but nothing could silence a question that haunted her. Why did they choose me? Emma became obsessed with finding answers. She sifted through old photographs, stared for hours at her own childhood face beside Lily and Grace. She kept journals filled with everything she could remember about the room, about Connie, about any clue that might lead them back. But the more she searched, the more it felt like chasing ghosts. "I feel like I'm still in that room," she once told her therapist, "just waiting, still the quiet." When the town began to move on slowly, cautiously, the church picnic was permanently canceled. St. Mary's underwent leadership changes, renovations, and issued public statements denying any involvement or knowledge of the crimes. But some residents couldn't forget Brookville had become a place where something sacred had been broken and no amount of paint or prayer could cover. The cracks. Rebecca, now in her early 60s, kept the front porch light on every night. She believed if Lily or Grace ever found their way home, they'd recognize the house. She also kept their rooms unchanged, beds made, clothes folded, a new calendar hung each year on the wall. As if time hadn't passed, Emma, trying to live beyond survival, enrolled in a community college under a real name. She studied psychology, hoping to one day help others who'd been stolen from themselves. But the weight of not knowing always hovered over her. Some nights she'd sit alone in the backyard and listen to the wind, remembering a story Connie used to whisper before bed. "Some children are like candles, blow them out, and no one even knows they were burning." Now Emma held a match in her hand, and she was still trying to light the dark. 17 years of silence, followed by the return of one daughter, should have brought healing. But in truth, it brought something else entirely, an open wound that would never close. Rebecca Whitmore, once a smiling, soft-spoken mother 3, had become a symbol of quiet perseverance. The years had carved worry into her face and left her voice quieter, as if always on the verge of breaking. And now, even with Emma home, the question that tormented her wasn't why, but why only her. She kept 3 photo frames on the fireplace. One of them had been updated. Emma, at 24, smiling shyly in a new college ID. The other 2, Lily and Grace, remained frozen in time in sundresses and ribbons, 7 years old, unchanged. Untouched. Emma felt the weight of those frames. Every day she tried to be present, to be the daughter her mother still deserved, but no amount of hugs or soft laughter at the dinner table could erase the absence. Sometimes, when Emma left the room, Rebecca would stare at the 2 older photographs and whisper, "I didn't forget you, I never will." The town of Brookville changed too. Once a place where everyone knew each other's name, it had grown, where parents no longer let children play alone at church events. The old woods near St. Mary's were fenced off, declared private land by the parish. The annual picnic, once the most anticipated gathering of the summer, was canceled indefinitely. Trust was fractured, and with each passing year fewer people spoke of what happened. But for the Whitmore family, it was still the center of everyday. Emma, despite her gentle demeanor, carried her own scars. She rarely spoke of Connie anymore, but nightmares betrayed her silence. She'd wake at 2 a.m., drenched in sweat, gasping for air, convinced she heard crying to the walls. Rebecca would rush and hold her, whisper that she was safe. But Emma didn't always believe it. She enrolled in a support group for survivors of abduction. At first, she didn't speak, just listened. Then slowly, piece by piece, she began to share her story. Other women cried with her, Some shared similar memories, basement silence, the manipulation of identity. For the first time, Emma didn't feel alone. Still questions plagued her. What if her sisters had survived? What if they had been taken elsewhere? What if they were alive, but had never been lucky enough to escape? She wrote letters addressed to Lily and Grace, and kept them in a box under her bed. Some were long, filled with memories that didn't belong to her anymore. Others were only a sentence, "I'm sorry I left Rebecca," once found the box, and quietly added 2 more letters of her own. Meanwhile, the investigation slowed, with Connie dead, Richard Galloway in assisted care, and no physical remains of the other girls. Prosecutors had no one to charge. The case remained open but dormant like a grave, without a marker in the eyes of the law. There was hope in the eyes of the family. There was only absence. The broader community began to forget, but every few years an article would circulate. One triplet returned. What happened to the other 2 people? Would comment with theories, with blame, with cold speculation. Some accused the church, others accused Daniel Whitmore, who had died in a car accident just 3 years after the girls disappeared. Rebecca never responded to any of them. She had learned to grieve in silence. One day, Emma gave a talk at a university psychology seminar titled "Surviving the Silence." She didn't use PowerPoint, no statistics, just her voice. "I was stolen," she said softly, "and so were my sisters, but the world only. Look for me when I came back, please. If you know something, anything about someone who's disappeared, say it, even if you're afraid, even if you think it's too late. Because silence doesn't protect us, it buries us." A room with still a few students cried. A professor stood to clap. Slowly, deliberately, Emma walked off the stage and disappeared into the hallway. But her words stayed back home. That night, Rebecca placed a candle in the window, something she hadn't done in years. Not for Emma, but for Lily and Grace. She whispered their names like a prayer. Somewhere in another town, a girl might see that light and wonder why it felt familiar. Somewhere another silence might be ready to break. It was a quiet spring morning when Emma visited the cemetery for the first time. There were no headstones for Lily and Grace, only 2 small white markers the town had installed years earlier, engraved with the words, "Still missing, still loved." Emma stood before them in silence, a bouquet of daisies in her hand and questions in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, kneeling down, "for forgetting, for surviving, for not being strong enough to stop them." The wind moved softly through the trees in the distance. The sound of the school bell echoed across the valley. Life continued, but for the Whitmore family, time had never moved forward. It had only curled on itself, returning to the same question again and again. Where did they go? The mystery of Lily and Grace's disappearance remained unsolved, with no remains, no confirmed sightings, and no confessions. The girls remained ghosts in the eyes of the law. Statistically, authorities presumed them dead, but Rebecca refused to call them that in her home. They were simply not home, yet she kept their room just as it was in 2001. Bright walls, a twin bed for each dolls lined up on the shelf. Every year on their birthday, she placed a gift on each bed, wrapped in pastel paper, labeled with their names and her handwriting. Emma, now 24, still lived nearby. She had started working at a local advocacy center, helping families of missing children navigate the overwhelming maze of hope and heartbreak. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She had become a voice for those still lost, and yet she was haunted not by what she could remember, but by what she couldn't. Her therapist once asked, "Do you think forgetting was your mind's way of protecting you?" Emma answered maybe, but it also protected them, because somewhere in those gaps of memory, behind Connie's whispers in the dark corners of the basement, might have been a key to everything. The final moments of her sisters, who came to take them, why she was spared, who paid Connie what the message really meant, and maybe, just maybe, who else knew. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in her mother's attic, Emma found something strange. A cassette tape it was, unmarked, dusty, tucked between old church newsletters and newspaper clippings about the girl's disappearance. She brought it downstairs and played on an old tape deck. At first, only static, then a faint voice. It was a woman, raspy, tired. "I've done what was asked." She's quiet. She listens. The others, they cried. Too much silence. Then he said, "It's better this way." Said no one would ask questions. Emma paused to tape her hand, shaking. She rewound it, played again. He said no one would ask questions. Who was he? Emma turned the name over and over in her mind. Could have been Richard Galloway, or someone else, someone who had the money, the influence, the desire to erase 3 lives, and the power to make the world look away. She brought the tape to the police forensic analyst, worked to enhance the sound, but it was old, degraded. They couldn't identify the voice. The only clue was a brief background hum, an organ playing faintly in the distance, a hymn possibly recorded inside a church. But which one and why record it? All investigators try to reopen the case with this new evidence, but without a voice match or a living suspect to question the tape, was just another whisper in the dark. Still, it gave Emma something she hadn't had in a long time: purpose. She began speaking at conferences, appeared on podcasts, wrote articles under her full name, Emma Whitmore. She refused to be anonymous anymore. I came home, she said at one event, but my sisters didn't, and I believe someone still knows why the world watched, listened, cared for a moment. But eventually, even the most gripping stories are replaced by new ones. The news cycle moved on, the interviews stopped, the donations slowed. But Rebecca and Emma didn't stop. They couldn't. Every Sunday, Rebecca left 3 chairs at the kitchen table, one for herself, one for Emma, and one empty just in case, because what if one day a knock came at the door? What if one day another girl with familiar eyes stepped out of the shadows? What if one day, after all this time, the silence finally broke? Until then there was only waiting, not hopelessly, but faithfully. 17 years was a lifetime stolen for Emma. It meant growing up in the shadow of a lie for Rebecca. It meant waking every day with hope balanced on heartbreak. And for Lily and Grace, whose voices were never heard again, it meant vanishing into the quiet corners of a world that failed them. But this story is not just about loss. It's about what remains: love that refuses to forget, a mother's light in the window, a sister's voice rising from silence. It's about fighting for truth, even when answers never come, about believing against all odds that justice doesn't expire with time. The mystery of what happened at that church picnic may never be fully solved, but Emma's return cracked open a truth no one could deny: something was taken, and someone still knows why. So if you ever see a face that looks too familiar, or hear a story that sounds too strange, listen, watch, speak. Because sometimes the only thing standing between silence and salvation is someone who refuses to let the story end.